All right, well, thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate you getting up this morning. I know it's not easy for any of us. My name is Mike Dahlgren. I'm a cloud solution architect for Red Hat based up in Minneapolis.
And I'm Ashley Nelson. I'm a Linux administrator at General Mills. I've been doing Linux for about 2 years now, and it's been a lot of fun working with all of you, seeing you at the user groups, working with the Red Hat team and their products. So thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And then I think this is a really good story. I really thank General Mills for letting us come out here and tell it. Because what's interesting about General Mills is they knew what they wanted, they had a good direction, and they had already had a good process going. And so we say saving 75% of the time, but really we're going from hours to minutes. We're not talking days, months, or weeks, or years. So out of curiosity, does anyone else here have their VMs or anything to provision take less than a week? Less than a month? There's a few of those. Yeah, so that's a process that can take a little bit of time. And so unless you have this all figured out already, this is the talk for you. So we're going to go over a few different things today. First off, just briefly talk about the changing IT landscape and then why we have to worry about automation, why configuration management systems are important, and really why we're here. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about the background of General Mills, in case you're not familiar, where they're coming from. We'll mention a little bit about CloudForms if you've never seen it. We'll do an overview there, a little level set, and then how CloudForms and General Mills working together was able to make the solution that we're going to discuss. After that, any future plans we may have, and then like lessons learned. At the end, hopefully we'll have some time for some questions, and if not, you can contact us or find us after the talk. So it's interesting. I use this slide a lot, and it's surprising to me how many people have never thought about this before. But we really do live in unprecedented times. So first off, right, the world's largest taxi cab has no vehicles. Who am I talking about? Uber. Everybody knows Uber, right? The world's largest media owner creates no content? Facebook, absolutely. The world's most valuable retailer has no stores? No. Alibaba. And finally, the world's largest hotel provider has no real estate? Absolutely. The real takeaway here, and the point I want to make, is the differentiator is not what you have in your company, it's how you derive value from the automation of the things that provide value. So it doesn't matter what that thing is in your company is, if you can automate the part that brings value, you can scale to new levels. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I really like this presentation because this diagram has no arrows in it, right? It's kind of a confusing place where we're moving, most people are probably started out in physical, and I would say, I'd say most people have moved from physical to virtual, right? Last 10 years, that's a big change in the environment. Some people are looking at private and public clouds, and maybe 10 to 20% of people have moved their stuff there. But it's also shifting back. We got big data, we got other workloads going in. That's kind of moving around where IT looks on this chart. It's not a single spot as it was before. At the same time, we're adding complexity. You can't just go around your data center and find the old beige box and say, what is this thing? You know, what is this thing still doing here? Now you have to keep track of spreadsheets, and you have to keep track of processes to figure out what these things are. And so we're seeing about a 10x density with virtualization than we had over just physical machines. Now, once you apply stuff like containers, it's not easier, it's actually harder. Now you have 100 containers for every single machine, and you have to have that process, and you have to have that management down, or you're going to get bogged down once you get inside of it. Throw in stuff like software-defined networking and software-defined storage, and what the reality is this is not the IT industry that we had 5 years ago. Things have changed. The landscape has changed, and it's not going to go back. So why General Mills? Well, like I said before, they did a fantastic job of being excited, understanding like what they needed to do, and building out that process. And so I'll let Ashley talk a little bit about them, and we'll cut back.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So just to give you some background on General Mills, so you know where we're coming from, you can compare your company to ours and see if we have any similar challenges. We are a Fortune 500 food manufacturing company located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we have brands such as Big G with Cheerios and Lucky Charms, and Betty Crocker and Pillsbury, which you might recognize. And we have about 42,000 employees globally, more than 100 countries. And we definitely see that on the IT side. We have a lot of business users and applications to support because of that. And we have about 600 IT employees doing that. So I'm on the Linux team at General Mills and just wanted to give you some background of what my team does for the company. First off, system administration. We work with all of the Linux servers in the company. That includes provisioning of those servers, patching for security vulnerabilities and updates. We also handle our entire Linux virtualization environment and the storage and SAN for the entire enterprise, and general data backups. But our most important job is keeping the lights on. We have a lot of manufacturing plants across the world that run 24/7, and they rely on a lot of applications that run on Linux servers. And if there's any sort of unplanned outage, it can be pretty catastrophic for our production lines. So that's a big pressure for our IT org. And we also have a lot of international offices, so people constantly using applications throughout the day, even while the headquarters people are sleeping, they still need to be running. So those are some challenges we have. What we wanted to address was a lot of challenges we've had lately. We've had a lot of server requests due to big data, a lot of burgeoning open source applications that our company and business users want to adopt. So for example, big data has caused us to go from, first of all, we had all physical servers, then we moved to a mostly virtual environment, and then big data has caused us to, again, like triple our physical server count. So we're going like right back to where we came from. It's a lot of work for our team and other neighboring teams. So we have some challenges we needed to address. When it comes to server provisioning, everything needs to be tracked. We want to keep track of why servers are being created, who's doing them, who the owner is. Systems also need to be consistent, so it's good to have a set process. You want to know what you're dealing with, with every server that you come across. And these processes are kind of hard to enforce. So you might have a teammate that doesn't like committing Git changes or just kidding, John. It's really hard when you have humans going through all these long processes to keep them consistent and enforce them. So those are challenges we looked to address, and that is where CloudForms came in. Mike's going to talk about what exactly that is.
Yep. And just for the people who have never seen CloudForms before, I just want to do a couple slides on level setting. So CloudForms is a lot of things. It's probably one of the hardest things to talk about from a Red Hat perspective because it does so much and it does them so well. But really what it comes down to, it's probably 4 main core features. It's all about unified management. I want to be able to plug into all my providers. I want to look at my public cloud, my private cloud, my virtualization, my containers. I want to see them in one space, in a single namespace, and so I can control and automate it. The second part is self-service. And it's often considered, when we say self-service, 90% of the time people want is like a virtual machine. But there's no reason why that has to be. If I want to have a WordPress site, right, or some kind of database, that could be a self-service action. It doesn't have to be a virtual machine at the end of the day. Finally, operational visibility. I can't automate what I can't see. First, I have to see my environment. The second part then is I can make automations around it. But the key part is being able to look into every part of the environment, what it is. And finally, compliance and government. And I actually get way more excited about this than people probably should, because in a past life, I used to do a lot of DHS, like contract work, and compliance and governance was a big part of my job. It was not a very easy one, and this is one of those kind of tools that makes this significantly easier. So as we see, so that's all on the top, and then below that, we have our containers, our virtualization, our private cloud, our public cloud. You know, these things are all inside of that, or can be managed with CloudForms to give you a single space to look at. So let's back up a second. Like before CloudForms, what happens, right? Every time you ask for a service in your IT organization, you have different people trying to do different things. So a user comes in, or a developer comes in, and they request a service. And they may be working with the sysadmins, the VMware people, or the virtualization people, the storage people, networking people, you name it, who is on the other side, the security people, but it's always the same questions that are being asked. And there's a lot of them, right? So like, do we have IP addresses? Do we need this much RAM? Who's in charge of it? Who's going to be responsible for it? How do we clean up for it? Who's paying for this? How do we know where it goes? And most importantly, like, how do we know when we don't need it anymore? These are tough problems. And every time we have a service request, it kind of goes back and forth to do the same thing over and over. But there's no reason why we need to do that. Because if we automate it, really it simplifies it down to the request comes in, the output comes out. We know what we need to do ahead of time. We can draw it out and figure out what that looks like. And then we just go through it. Because at its simplest state, CloudForms is really a state machine. And what I mean by that is a state machine is just a bunch of steps that is required to get something done. So let's say I want to build out a virtual machine. It may be 30 steps to finish that VM, but as I get through, I need to make sure that they all work and they're complete, and I need and unroll if they don't work. Because the last thing I need is something to happen is a user goes in there and it breaks 27 steps down, and they just keep ordering broken VMs until my environment fills up. So these are the things we got to think about, but we have to automate the whole process and also automate the exceptions. So what does it look like? Well, if you've never seen CloudForms before, just a couple of quick little slides of what the dashboard looks like. If you logged in, this is actually just out of one of our labs. You're going to see different data from like, here's all the, oops, this thing's being funny today. Nope, we're not using a laser pointer. So you're going to see different providers, you're going to see different charts, but really this is multi-tenant. You can customize this any way you want and show users what they need visibility into, but nothing else, right? If they're only development in the cloud, only show them those pieces. The idea is like breaking that down for them. The next thing that people don't usually realize about CloudForms, it actually has more than one portal. So what we showed before is like the admin portal that most people use, but it's actually got a self-service portal that's totally separate. That's cut down, it's just for user requests. The irony about this is a lot of people will actually just skip this all together and just go with the API, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But just so you know, this is what a simple self portal looks like. And finally, you know, we have the full visibility of the environment. So we have heat maps, we can tell what load is where, we can do trend line analysis, you know, maybe my storage is 80% full, maybe my storage will be full in 1 month. You know, I need to know both these things, not just the one. And so CloudForms really provides that for you, and it gives you that kind of detail that you don't get any other way across all of your systems and environments.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to talk about how General Mills used CloudForms. But first of all, when we had all of those challenges that I addressed earlier, it came time to look into different products that kind of solve all of those challenges. And we compared 2 products, and it's important to note this was a little over a year ago, so they have both changed a lot. But we had CloudForms 3.2, and then just another kind of similar cloud orchestration provisioning product. So one of the first things we looked at was flexibility. We wanted to make sure we had a lot of control over every step of provisioning. There's a lot of customization we like to have in our environment, and it was important that we had insight into all the steps. So CloudForms seemed to win on that front. You can make it do pretty much anything you want to do. There's an option to write code for what you want to do. There's a lot of stuff built in already. So that was cool. As a result, the complexity of CloudForms was much higher than the other product. And that's kind of the cost that you have to pay if you have a product with a lot of advanced features. It does take a while to learn. You can't expect to do stuff right away with it. You have to make a commitment to learning the product. So complexity front was kind of challenging. When it comes to the GUI, CloudForms wasn't quite as intuitive as the other product. And code-wise, however, I liked that we did have the option to write our own code in CloudForms. The other product, you had to do everything just through using a GUI. And there are a lot of things, as you know, that are just a lot faster being done by code. GUIs, you can repetitively drag and drop things, and code, you just write a for loop or something like that. So it was nice that we had that additional control, and the code also allowed us to see what CloudForms was doing behind the scenes. All of the code that comes baked into CloudForms is exposed to you, and you can use that to write your own code or just make small customizations. And the code is Ruby, by the way. So I was not familiar with Ruby. I'd never worked with it before getting CloudForms, but I was able to learn it and go off of existing examples, and it ended up being just fine. So integration was another thing we looked into. CloudForms, since you can write your own code and it has a lot of integration support right out of the box, was a clear winner in that category. It can work with external clouds like Amazon and Azure and I think Google Compute Engine now, and it can also work with either VMware or Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization. It has really good built-in support for both of those virtual environments. So you don't have to change what you currently have in order to use CloudForms, which was nice. The other product just kind of worked with its own environment. It was a very kind of internal, encapsulated thing. The roadmap for both seemed pretty good. They both intended on adding a lot of features and a lot more capabilities. And I really liked the CloudForms roadmap because we already have Red Hat Satellite and we use their servers, and that there's a lot more integration that's planned for that. And then as for the POC, one of the other teams at General Mills had already been using the other product, which is why we looked at that too. And they had been using it or trying to set it up for about a couple of years before we started looking into these things, and they were not having a fun time with it. So we kind of took their word for it and decided to look at CloudForms POC just to see if that was the right thing for us. So we get to the CloudForms POC. Red Hat gave us a 60-day free trial period, which was very nice. That gave us enough time to fully set it up the way we want it and get something working. That was plenty of time to work with a consultant. They flew out and assisted us for 3 days. They made sure to teach us how CloudForms worked and helped us set up like a list of requirements that we provided to them, which was really helpful. So he didn't just come here and have us click things and then leave. He definitely made sure we learned it and understood it, and even offered his help after he left. But we didn't actually have to ask him for continued help, just because having him there was so helpful in the first place. So he showed us some code that apparently a lot of Red Hat cloud engineers have their own GitHub accounts, and they write a lot of code that can easily be integrated into their products. So that's a good thing to check out. And in the end, we did choose CloudForms over the other product. Red Hat's a very strategic partner of ours. They listen to our feedback and feature requests and are very good at communicating with us on those. And it fit into our ecosystem really well. Again, we have Satellite and are a big Linux customer, so we liked the feature integration plans. And it's also open source, which was very different from the other product. That explained why the other product kind of only supported their own software integrations. With open source, you have a lot of different people that can contribute to a product. Even you can contribute your own code if that's something that you want to do. ManageIQ is the open source project that CloudForms is built on. So that definitely helped us choose that as well. There are a lot of resources available, and like forums, people that have problems with ManageIQ have the same problems with CloudForms, and you can all work together and figure out solutions, so that was helpful. It was also the most flexible and versatile. You can write your own code and connect it to pretty much anything. And it's also important to note that CloudForms is there for more than just VM provisioning. The idea is that you can have users go into this portal and provision pretty much any service that they want, and you don't have to get a VM as the result. So in the end, well, I wouldn't say end. We're still working on CloudForms and planning to add more things continually. But right now, we allow users to provision RHEL 6 and 7 VMs. We have an automatic approval for under 10. We were able to integrate our existing scripts just by calling them from CloudForms and kicking them off. And we have an email and retirement workflow as well. So I'll just go more in depth about what our current provisioning process looks like. The idea behind CloudForms is that it is a state machine kind of framework. So all of your processes are these state machines that call methods as you go down, and each method takes care of some part of the provisioning process. So for example, this is my provisioning state machine. The screen is a lot further away than the one I practiced with, but we will try it anyway. So we have the user request from a VM portal. Mike showed you what that catalog looks like. And for us, we're very generous. If it is greater than 10 VMs that they request, there's an email approval workflow where it basically sends our team an email, and we have to go in and accept or reject the request. If they want fewer than 10 VMs, then it goes into our provisioning state machine, which I will elaborate on in the next slide. If the provisioning is successful, then we email the user letting them know that their VM is set up and they're ready to log into it, and that usually happens about 15 to 20 minutes after their request, which is very speedy. If it fails, it emails our team and the user saying that we're looking into it, and we'll follow up with them. The provisioning state machine in detail After the request, we pull all of the user's dialog values and put it in a provisioning task. So another thing I should mention about how CloudForms works is they also have these things called objects, and you store a bunch of key value pairs in them. And in this case, we have a provisioning object. Our key value pairs are things like network or CPU or memory, basically any attributes you would have around a VM. And then that is what's passed into either VMware or Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization. You just have this object full of key value pairs. And where CloudForms comes in is it knows exactly what to do with those objects and how to communicate with your virtualization environment for provisioning. So that is what I'm referring to when I say we store the dialog values in this task object. We then enter the next step, and that's where we store all of our own custom values that are consistent across all VMs. And that includes disk size, the networks that we want it to be attached to, the location in our virtualization environment, like which folder. And after that, we submit the provisioning task. And that's where CloudForms does its work behind the scenes, where it actually takes that task, uses an API for either VMware or Rev, and creates the VM. Once it is notified that the VM has been created in that environment, we go on to the network registration. We register it with our IP management system through DHCP and gets its DNS name in there. We then monitor in CloudForms. We have a custom task that keeps checking for the DNS resolution of that name. And once it actually sees an IP address show up for that domain name, we move on to the next step. And that is our post-build script. So this is something that we already had for our manual provisioning environment, and that's what hooks the VM up to its authorization system and satellite and Puppet. So that's a script that we just have already written in Python. CloudForms kicks it off on an existing server. And then the OS updates and post-configuration are handled in that script as well. And then we email the user saying that it's done. So that is, those are all of the steps in our state machine. And then I also mentioned we have a retirement workflow. So by default, CloudForms has a workflow where during provisioning, you can set a retirement warn date, and you can set a retirement date. And on its own, CloudForms will send out an email to the user for retirement warn, saying that your VM will be expiring on whatever date you set at creation. But we wanted to extend that workflow and allow the user to request more time. And so this is an example of what our updated state machine looks like for retirement. So let's say you're about 1 week out. That's usually when we set our retirement warn date. The user's emailed, given the option to renew. And if they renew, then the retirement date's updated for 6 months later. At time of provisioning, users can select 6 months or never. Those are the two options right now. And you can probably guess what most people choose. But so if they choose to never retire, the VM is kind of immortal. Right now, we are not like full to capacity with VMs, so that's not a problem. But we could definitely change that in the future if we see a lot of people provisioning them for no reason.
And I think it's important to mention, like people think that's funny that we have VMs that go forever, but really that's the way it works today. You know, in every other environment you build stuff and now you have to manually track it down. And it's actually something that we do at Red Hat internally as well. So if I want an OpenStack environment or an OpenShift environment to test with, I'll just order it and a week later I get an email that says like, hey, we're gonna shut it down unless you renew this for another week. Yeah. Because I personally think, I like to think that I'm gonna go in there and actually clean up after myself, but I won't. And I know I won't. So for just having that process and that loop in that flow is really huge.
Yeah. And then if the user chooses not to do anything once they get that retirement warning, the VM is just archived for now. It's removed from all of its services and powered down, but not deleted, just in case we do need to recover data for whatever reason. But nobody has needed that yet. So this is what our request dialog looks like. So just so you can get an idea of the kind of things we need from our users in order to provision a VM. We ask them for a name, and then we have a step in the state machine that kind of appends our own naming standard onto what they specify. We also allow them kind of free range of CPU and memory. It's just a text box. They can type in what they want. It's up to our virtualization environment at that point to bat it down if they ask for too much. Template, that's a field that is kind of grayed out. It's hard-coded into this form, and that's just how we are able to write code around which template to use. And then they can specify their AD group for login and sudo access to the server, and that's something that we handle in our script that sets up Puppet. We end up passing that into the script later on in the state machine, and then it can apply the correct groups to that access. And then lastly, provisioning options, so they can specify a number of VMs that they want, and CloudForms will automatically increment the number at the end of the VMs if you specify a lot, and a retirement time, again, of 6 months or never. And this is just a zoomed out view of that same order form, so you know what it looks like just generally in the UI. Okay, so this is the automate engine that I was referring to. This is where all of the code in CloudForms is actually stored. So we end up hooking up the request dialog that I showed you to a state machine that exists somewhere in the set of folders. And I'll explain what all of these mean. So right now, you can see on the right, there's just a lot of folders and groupings of things. This is where all the state machines reside, and this is where the methods that those state machines call also reside. And you can see here there's a list of data stores. We have GenMills on the top, and then Red Hat just beneath that, and ManageIQ on the very bottom. And how this works is it's kind of a hierarchy. So if you want to customize a state machine or a method that comes in the default like ManageIQ project, you essentially make a copy of that state machine or method to your own company data store. And the way that the engine works is it first looks in your own data store for that method existing, and if it doesn't, it works its way down. And that's basically how your custom code is applied. It sits on top of the code that comes with the open source project.
And the nice thing about that is, so if you update the appliance, the underlying methods could be updated, but your code doesn't get modified. So since you overlay what comes with the product, you don't have to worry about it getting clobbered in the same way you might with something else.
Yeah, that is a good point. We've been able to update it quite a few times, and we haven't noticed any performance degradation or errors or anything. So this is an example of a customization step in the state machine. This was that second step that I pointed out earlier in our flowchart. This is where I take that provision object, that's just an object of key value pairs, and I actually put our custom values into those keys. So for example, we can say the customization spec that we want to use that allows a host to override the template host name with the one that you specify. We have the network that we want it to be on. We want the VM to auto power on once it's provisioned. So you'll see some key value pairs that are maybe specific to CloudForms here, like the auto on, as well as ones that are specific to VMs in general. And then set our folder, so that's where we want it to show up in our virtualization environment, and then one core per socket. And then, so I showed you how users request a VM, and I showed you all of the code. This is how those requests are actually connected to the code. So you can see there's a provisioning entry point, a reconfigure entry point, and a retirement entry point. And what those do is basically point to the state machine that you want kicked off for certain events. So when a user is requesting a VM and they click submit, that automatically kicks off this provisioning entry point. And you can see that's linked to some custom code in our GenMills domain. If that didn't exist for whatever reason, it would work its way down and look for it in the Red Hat or ManageIQ data stores. But that kicks off our build VM from template state machine. There's also an option for users when they click on a VM after they've provisioned it, they can reconfigure it. That's something that you can write code to do, and we just have not done that. So we don't have a reconfigure entry point, but that's definitely on the roadmap if users want to increase their memory or CPU, we do plan to add that so our team is entirely hands-off. And then a retirement entry point. So that's pointing to the default retirement state machine that comes with ManageIQ, and we just customized a few methods in there that allow them to extend retirement as well. So that is kicked off automatically by CloudForms. Once it notices that it's the retirement date for a VM, it'll kick off whatever's in that entry point. And then this is just an example of what it looks like when you click on one of your VMs within CloudForms. And you can see in the top right, we have a GMI dropdown with a button that says Extend Retirement. So that's an example of how you can add your own capabilities into CloudForms. And again, that button just points to a state machine that changes the retirement date that the user requests. So in the end, it's important to know what came in the box with CloudForms, what we had to customize on our own. And out of the box, the API calls that we use for our virtualization environment, whether they're VMware or Rev, are built into CloudForms. You just give them an object full of keys and values, and they know what to do with it to create that VM. We also have the best fit placement algorithms that come in CloudForms, so you can choose, they have algorithms for determining which data store has the most free space, while also taking into account who has access to provision to that data store. It kind of combines access management and free space, and it's written for you in both VMware and Rev, so it can detect which environment you're using and then place it where you most want, but you can also customize that. There's also the service state machine. Basically, that whole framework is what we find convenient in CloudForms. It has error handling and retries, and the whole framework that takes care of email approval is very convenient to have. And services are also baked into the user view. So just basically, that just means the framework and how helpful that is. We also have provisioning scope and tags out of the box, and that's how you control what users are able to see. You can make sure teams of people are able to see each other's VMs, or people are only able to see their own VMs. And I like their access management strategy here. On our own, we created the templates that people provision from. So those have the operating systems already installed on them, and they have some scripts that kick off on first boot to customize some things. We also created the request dialogs. This is so CloudForms provides you with the drag and drop and UI tools to actually create these dialogues. So I guess it's technically out of the box and on our own. The retirement state machine we customized, as I explained, to have a certain warn date and maybe not expire it right away. We just archive it but not delete it. Puppet and satellite integration was all us. We had an existing script that we were just able to call from CloudForms to do that part. So that's not something we actually wrote into the state machine. And then additional VMware API calls such as extending disk for allowing users to reconfigure their disk size. So in the end, through our pipeline of VM provisioning, we improved in a lot of places. Fully automating this forced us to look at our current manual provisioning process, see where it can be optimized and automated. And an example of a lot of time savings was how we handled DNS. So in our manual process, we have static DNS, and it takes about a couple hours to roll out in our environment, which only adds to the amount of time between when a user requests and gets their VM. So with CloudForms, we decided to go the route with DHCP and have our IP management system give a VM a 2-week DHCP lease, and that cut it down to 5 minutes for the DNS portion. Configuration management, so a lot of our manual process involved hooking it up to Puppet, signing certificates, and running an agent on the VM. And in addition to that, watching software install. We would install all of the OS updates and then reboot the VM, and that just added more time to the manual process. So now that can all happen behind the scenes in CloudForms, and our team doesn't even have to be aware when someone's creating a VM. Also, the biggest factor in our manual provisioning process was just finding the time to respond to a VM request. If you need to dedicate a couple hours a day to responding to those and provisioning, even though it may not be a lot of time, it's still hard to find time in that full block. So with CloudForms, request responses are immediate. They kick off, and the user gets them within 15 to 20 minutes. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's important to know that a service in CloudForms is not necessarily a VM. So when a user goes to a service catalog, there are a lot of options, and they may not necessarily all be VMs. So this is something that I was working on in CloudForms as well, is allowing a user to provision a MongoDB container. They don't know it's a container and don't need to know, but if they want a MongoDB database, they click on the MongoDB catalog item, and they can specify the space they need, the data classification. If it's classified or special controls, then there's an approval process. Otherwise, it allows them to automatically create it. And then they can specify a default admin password. And this is an example of what the state machine for that would look like. It's basically just 2 steps in that state machine. This uses a Docker API to create a container from a MongoDB image and then start that container. And then you can respond to the user in the next step of the state machine saying that it's been provisioned. So a lot of these catalog items can be super simple and quick and have 2 steps. So in the end, CloudForms does save us a lot of time per year. We've had hundreds of VMs created through CloudForms already in the year and a half it's been running, and a lot of these have been sandbox VMs. It's in our sandbox environment right now. We are looking to move it to enterprise, but sandbox is where we see the most VM requests that have the smallest value, essentially. So it was a good place to start. So it can save about 1,000 hours a year, which is an entire half a person. And I know you all have better things to do than provision VMs for people. So we thought this was very valuable for us. Something I noticed about the usage of CloudForms at our company was my team is actually the biggest customer. And there's absolutely no hesitation now if there's something we want to try out, an open source project or just training VMs or anything like that, we don't hesitate to spin up multiple of those. For patching, I was testing out an Ansible workflow, and I just provisioned like 20 servers through CloudForms without even thinking about it, and it's very helpful to have for that. We have a lot of other neighboring teams that use CloudForms as well. Application developers, a lot of operations and infrastructure teams. They use them for training VMs and proof of concepts, and have been loving it as well. So now, even though we do have a working CloudForms solution, there's always room for improvement and additional plans. So in the long term, we do plan to incorporate some external cloud environments. It's helpful to have a single place to view all of your VMs, just one inventory, and CloudForms can be very helpful with that. We'd also like to manage services and not just VMs, so allow for more databases to be provisioned, kick off some Ansible workflows through CloudForms. We can also connect web apps to the CloudForms API. So there are some portals right now for requesting servers that we may not want people to redirect to CloudForms for, so we can just use the CloudForms API to kick off automation for those. And we'd also like to add reconfiguring abilities, such as CPU, memory, and disk extension for users, just to completely remove all of the effort from our team. So Mike, if you'd like to lead off advice.
Sure. So this is a great example of what's possible in really a short amount of time with a few individuals. But the important part here is we want to crawl, walk, and run, right? We're not going to boil the ocean on the first day. But the hardest thing to do is actually to go and whiteboard what you want to have done. Because if you can draw it all out on a whiteboard, you can automate it. But you can't automate what you don't think about. And it's a surprisingly tricky problem until you actually draw it out. So really the key thing here is figure out what you want to do. The technical part's usually the easier part of the solution. We can make it work. We have the technology, right? And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's kind of a gradual thing. Let's automate the things that are the hardest first, and then we can go in there and touch on the things that are a little bit higher hanging fruit.
Okay. And something I've personally done was use a Git repo for all of the automation code. You can get some pretty lengthy state machine steps, and it's good to just have a record of all of those changes. So CloudForms lets you easily export that entire engine with all the data stores into a directory kind of layout. So I just copy that onto my own personal server and create a Git repo in there, and that's how I keep track of everything. I also recommend utilizing the open source community for ManageIQ. They have a GitHub where you can look up certain error codes you might see, or a good community at talk.manageiq.org. It's just a forum where people voice their questions and concerns. And then I'd also recommend separating sandbox and prod instances. So even though your users may only need to use one CloudForms portal, it's good to just have another one to try out changes on, because there's not a good way of making changes without having some sort of disruption, kind of like the normal reason for having dev and prod environments.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, and I want to thank General Mills for coming out here and agreeing to do this. So please, we take some questions here. You can contact us after this. If you liked us, you liked Ashley, you like breakfast cereal, please fill out the survey and let us know how we did. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So I would say there were two of us that worked with the consultant that flew out, and we're the primary people that have been making changes to CloudForms. So yeah, about two of us, and we're still the same two people. So, yes? That is not something we have right now. I guess global people are provisioning them, but they're still hosted on our internal virtualization environment. But our plan is to incorporate like our Azure space that has global VMs, and then those would be viewable within the CloudForms portal. Yes, they are. Yep. How many data centers or?
How many CloudForms instances?
Oh, CloudForms, sorry. Just one, actually. Well, and then the one that I make changes on. But users are all using just the one CloudForms appliance. I know you can have a more distributed CloudForms architecture, so like a separate database server and UI servers, but all of ours is just condensed into one box, and it's been working well for us. So. Yeah. I actually did not look at ManageIQ. We like the enterprise support that CloudForms comes with, and definitely access management is a huge thing, and LDAP integration and things like that. And I'm not actually too sure. Do you know anything about the ManageIQ project?
Yeah, so I think really it comes down to Red Hat's a service and support company. You know, and so if you want that, you're going to get CloudForms. If you want to do it yourself, you can use ManageIQ, right?
Yes. We do not do that, but that is an option within CloudForms. We don't have a problem with too many VMs going unused or created for no reason, but that is also an option in the future. Yeah.
So where you had the boxes for letting them say which groups needed login access and sudo access,
Yeah.
can it actually dynamically pull that information from another source to populate those drop-downs, or are you just trusting them to put in a value?
So we have a lot of groups in our Active Directory at General Mills. You can do dynamic drop-downs in CloudForms forms, but that was just going to be a lot of complexity that we didn't necessarily need. We kind of just rely on users to correctly type out the AD group name. And so far, I don't think it's been a problem, or they just recreate it if they did put in the incorrect name.
Sir.
It shows that you have VMware. Do you have any plans on moving to Red and using CloudForms to kind of bridge the gap between the two?
I'm not too sure. I think all of the products that we use are reviewed regularly. So far, we've been happy with our environment, something we already had, and luckily CloudForms can integrate into that really well. It's not biased toward any one product, so not really prompting a change.
Yes, sir. So that's an interesting question, right? So if you're using, let's say, like Rev on Power, I believe it works just fine with that. But outside of that, it's more of a custom solution. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that.
Yeah.
So as you create all these additional services, how much do you have to contact support to get somebody to help make those integrations or set up those services?
So our team manages a lot of the stuff that goes into like provisioning a full VM or making a service. So thankfully the automation was pretty simple on our end. I didn't have to, I was able to spin up my own Docker VM and connect to that myself through CloudForms. And the only time we do need people externally is for that database example, like security and policies and those kinds of things. We would work with other teams on, but for the most part, we have access to everything that needs to go into the automation. So, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So it's not really a problem that we fixed. It's mainly our manual process. With all of our enterprise VMs, we don't want them to just get any IP address that could potentially change if they've been off the network for 2 weeks. So we like maintaining those with static DNS, but for our POC environment, we didn't really feel that was quite as necessary. So just switching to DHCP management just made it much quicker. There's no user rollout involved or anything like that. Yep. Yes, so they can specify whatever host name they want, and we just append a number to it, and whatever we have to categorize a VM, just append it to whatever name they choose. And our customization spec allows that host name that they provide to be injected into the VM, and then we also have our IP management system associate an IP address with that name. So yeah, the user gets to choose entirely, pretty much entirely what their host name is. Oh. Oh. Okay. That's, yeah, so if they did want a very specific named point to, that's not anything that's built into CloudForms.
So you could plumb it in, but that's not the case today.
Yeah.
Is the short answer.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh. Capacity management. That's actually a feature that CloudForms supports. It can look at how much space you have left and kind of estimate how many VMs are left to create for certain bottlenecks like memory, data store, capacity.
So that's all there out of the box. So once it has visibility in your environment, it actually shows you that information and reports that back to you. And that's it. Well, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.